2, and 1. Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's event presented by 192 Books and Paula Cooper Gallery. I am Evan, the manager at 192 Books, and I could not be happier to welcome you to our conversation tonight on Gary Indiana's new book, Fire Season, out now from Seven Stories Press. This book collects some of Indiana's best work from 1984 through 2021, with pieces on politics, art, and life in America and across the world, really, as it careened into the 21st century. It is unmistakable, unique, and really truly irreverent style, true to the word irreverent. Indiana trains his eyes on figures such as Tracy Emin, Barbara Kruger, Renate Adler, Ronnie Horn, all, as Christian Lorentzen writes in his introduction to this collection, geniuses, and Indiana's criticism meets them at their level. We're lucky enough tonight to be joined by Gary Indiana himself, along with Christian Lorentzen, to discuss this new collection, about criticism in general, anything they'd like to talk about, really. If you don't already know, Gary Indiana is a novelist and critic known for books such as Horse Crazy, a trilogy of excellent true crime books, essay collections such as Wild Days, which collected his art columns from the Village Voice, and many more. Christian Lorentzen is a critic and actor. You may have seen him in the new play Dime Square, or have read his excellent reviews and pieces in places such as the London Review of Books, Harper's, the Financial Times, and Book Forum, among many others. So, without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Gary and Christian. Enjoy, everybody.
Hello, Gary.
Hi, Christian. I don't know whether to wear my glasses or not.
Yeah, same thing. I had lost these for a couple of years, but in my recent move, I found them again. So I find them useful in that they keep me from squinting.
Well, the pair I bought in Mexico City, I sat on the other night. So these are old ones.
Yeah, I stepped on these a few years ago in London, and they've never been the same since. But such is true of a lot of accidents in life. Would you, speaking of life's little accidents,
Yes.
how did you become a critic? And was it ever, I know before you were a critic, you had been a poet and a playwright and done many different types of writing. Was it accidental that you came into criticism?
I don't know if it was an accident. I didn't, because I did write, like, in very early times, I did write little essays, little critical essays or reviews of stuff. It was never my primary focus, but then I really didn't have much confidence about writing fiction, which is what I really wanted to do. So I started when I came to New York. I wrote pieces mostly on movies for Art Forum, and then I don't know. It was a weird segue to writing about art because I at some point approached Art in America because I wanted to publish a particular thing that I wanted to write, and so they said go ahead. And then I didn't realize there was a shortage of art critics, and they just kept giving me more things to do, like lots of little reviews of shows or different things, and then features as well. And within, I don't know, in a very compressed period of time, I wrote an awful lot for them, and then got offered the job at The Voice to do it on a weekly basis. Wasn't really what I wanted to do, but it also was a paycheck. So, and I was sort of desperate for money. So I took the job, and I liked it for a couple of years. And the last year, I didn't like it quite as much. I wanted to do reporting for them. So that's what I did after I finally got out of the art contract. And while I was at The Voice, I wrote a lot of stuff for The Voice Literary Supplement as well. I wrote a lot of book reviews. It's something, well, as you know, I mean, if you can do it, it can be a lot of fun to do it. It's a, It's not the same as writing fiction. It's a different part of your brain in a way. But you know, I just sort of fell into it, I guess. Um, I don't know. Do people actually say when they're, starting out like, oh, I really want to be a critic? I mean, I don't know, maybe.
I don't know. I think I might be a strange case in that I don't know if I somebody was asking me how I fell into it, and I just had to answer. Well, first I edited magazines where there were a lot of reviews. Then I just started winging it myself, and then I read a lot of critics who are older than me, including yourself, to rip you off and steal inspiration. So
Well,
the essays in this book, many of which I first encountered in the earlier collection, Let It Bleed, have been very important to me. And as you know, I've sometimes worked in lines to my own pieces in homage to you.
that's very sweet.
Um, so when, but in terms of this book combines criticism, reportage, and some pieces that are essentially columns, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how many. Uh, yeah, there are some that were actually columns for Vice
Yeah.
that I wrote for Vice. That was a weird gig. That was actually a fun thing to do when I did that. I mean, um,
Yeah, as I recall, you kind of hit a sweet spot in the history of Vice magazine when they still had a pretty high-paying print magazine, some good editors,
yeah,
and it
um,
turned into a content farm, which is how I think of it now. No offense.
yeah. I mean, it didn't stay sweet that long, but for the time that I did it, it was great because I could also do the visuals.
Oh yeah.
So I made all the illustrations, and I could go to Eastern Europe and just write about that and write about wherever I happened to be. I was traveling a lot in those days. But to go back to something you said earlier, what I was thinking was when I was a teenager and before I had really any confidence to become a writer, although it is what I wanted to do, like one of the people I really looked up to was Mary McCarthy. And Mary McCarthy wrote fiction and she wrote criticism as well, and she wrote essays as well. And she was a great model for me. I thought I would really love to be able to do what she does.
Was it in New Hampshire that you first encountered her writing?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was before I really knew much of anything about the world, except through reading.
Yeah. Which
Um,
book was it? If I to
um,
get a little specific, the group or one of the. For me, it was the company she keeps. I think.
no, the company she keeps, I think, was the one that I first read, and then as far as the essays, or which was also, I mean, with her, there were memoir kind of things. There were more critical oriented things. There were these collections. One was called The Humanist in the Bathtub, but it was just like a signet paperback collection of stuff. Her thing on Simone de Beauvoir. Um,
Could you get books like that at the drugstore in those days?
yes, I did. And the thing is that, Derry, New Hampshire is like a real backwater, and certainly was a real backwater then, but they had all those books, at the drugstore. Um, Funnily enough. Well, it was a time before this onslaught of mass media where, I mean, they didn't have Facebook then or anything like that, TV, but not, people still got information from books. Um,
What about your first encounters with European culture? Because a lot of your subjects in this book are European writers, artists, and filmmakers.
well, I had a big kind of, there were two books that very early, like I read them very early that I remember one was Jean-Paul Sartre, Nausea, his novel Nausea, and Andre Breton, Nadja, that novel. Um, I kind of, they sort of cast a spell on me in a way. I got much more interested. I was always much more interested in European literature than in American literature. I never liked the things that we're supposed to like in American literature, particularly. I didn't care much for Mark Twain and that sort of folksy,
Mm-hmm.
funny. I mean, I maybe appreciate him a little bit more now, but um, I, I mean, I did read American writers, but they always seemed to inhabit, writers like Bernard Malamud or Mayo. They all seem to inhabit a realm that I could never hope to, you know, penetrate, so to speak.
Though
Whereas
you
the
have,
Europeans, huh?
though you have in the end, I would argue.
Well, maybe, but I just found the Europeans much more accessible for me. Maybe it was the foreignness of it. Maybe it was the otherness of it that spoke to me more than things that were about like middle class American life, which I was drearily familiar with already.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I got and I like the idea of the avant-garde. I like the idea of the nouvelle roman and all these things. Um, it's more exciting period in terms of literature than there you could actually do something new, or something that people weren't drearily familiar with, like I was with the American middle class. But yeah, it just spoke to me more. I don't know why. Maybe because um, you know, American literature was extremely heterosexual too, in the 50s and 60s, early 60s. Um, there was a little more room, and from Genet and people like this, there was a little more that I could not identify with exactly, but it spoke to me more
Yeah.
uh, directly, it seemed. Um,
So, when you began reporting, what were your initial? There are several pieces in the book where you go back to New Hampshire, for example. You go to Missouri and Arkansas. You go to L.A. for the Rodney King trial, and what is it, Detroit for the Dr. Kevorkian trial.
yeah,
What were what were how what was the process of? I mean, obviously, those are some of the biggest stories of the time when you were getting on the road.
yeah.
How did those? What made those subjects? What attracted you to those particular subjects?
Well, to be honest, I can't remember exactly whether they were assigned to me or whether I asked for them. Um, I know uh, I wanted to do that. I wanted to cover the Kevorkian trial because it was already like fascinating to me, the whole question of assisted suicide and whether you had a legal right to kill yourself or not. And all of all the stuff around that. I think that it's weird because it's not that many years ago, but I cannot remember for the life of me if somebody suggested it or if I thought of it myself. Um, Going to Branson, I have a feeling it must have been my own idea because I knew it would be ghastly and sort of fun to dig into. Rodney King was like, I had lived in LA before I came to New York, and I was at that time still spending a certain amount of time in Los Angeles, which I still do. Um, and yeah, they were big stories, and I thought that I could do something with them, that I could cover them, maybe in a way that mainstream journalism wasn't covering them. I can't remember the origins of all of that, but they were things that were being discussed in a lot of, there were big stories. And also I felt that if I did like a really big story every 6 months, then I could just collect my paycheck the rest of the time and not do anything. So there was that.
Right.
Um,
How did doing those pieces inform or lead to or connect with your fiction, particularly the true crime trilogy of Resentment, Depraved Indifference, and 3 Month Fever?
well, I I think that one thing I discovered by covering things like the Kevorkian trial was like I could really sort of beam myself into the characters. I mean, they were real people, but I kind of thought, I bet I could I could work this person like a glove puppet. I mean, I could, get inside their head and I felt, for instance, with the Menendez brothers, and that kind of just came about in a strange way. I could imagine myself as them. I could imagine myself in that family, in that circumstance. I mean, I never really particularly wanted to kill my parents, but I could imagine wanting to, kill your parents. I could, it's a pretty common wish. Um, but also just uh, I don't know. I felt like I could do something with those subjects that was beyond like reportage.
Through the process of being in the same room with them, specifically a courtroom.
Yeah, actually. Um, it, and then Commandant, like the Commandant story, it was weird. I mean, I was looking at the reporting on it as he was, before he shot Versace, and the New York Times had run this, multi-panel pictures of him saying like he was a chameleon. He could look all of these different ways, and he could change his appearance. And so I cut all these little thumbnails out of the paper and sort of arranged them. And I said that no, it's just he's putting on weight. And, and I knew that the reporting itself was completely uninformed. I mean, because it was all about the homosexual underworld, about gay bars and stuff that the Times and these main media outlets didn't have a clue about.
Was the Times worse back then?
It's hard to say when the Times was worse. It's pretty bad now. I think, I mean, Renate Adler would disagree with me, but I think like in terms of anything to do with homosexuality, A.M. Rosenthal was a disaster. He was really homophobic, but I think the Times was better then in some ways simply because they used to run transcripts.
Right.
They used to run long transcripts of
In the
hearings.
itself,
Yeah,
pages on end.
yeah. And they don't do that anymore. Now it's more of an opinion newspaper. It's more of a, I mean, they devote um, so much of their space to things that I don't really consider news.
Right.
Um,
Opinion and features, but features that are often lack the depth of the old magazine feature from which they're drawing their form.
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, it was a better written newspaper. It was a better research newspaper. It was a better reported newspaper. But again, I mean, there were weaknesses in, I think they went too far in the other direction. It was like, they were very deficient in covering minority issues. They were very ill-informed about certain things or just not clued into certain things. And I think they've gone way off in the other direction. that, you just have this kind of Bible of political rectitude that seems to inform everything. And so you can never just say what happened. You have to say what, terrible social forces caused such and such. I can't articulate this very well. I can't stand the Times as it is today. I can't read it.
What about the other paper? For instance, in your 1992 primary report from New Hampshire, there are it's interspersed with a lot of remarks about the Manchester Union leader.
Well, that paper I grew up with.
Yeah.
That was the newspaper of record in New Hampshire, so to speak. And it was like the just really incredibly flimsy right-wing crackpot paper. I think I mentioned in the piece that they had once run a front page op-ed titled "Kissinger the Kike?" question mark. Yeah, they were nuts. I mean, it was really like a radical right-wing newspaper, but also pandering to like just the ignorance of uneducated people.
Yeah, with undue influence in the American electoral process. I mean,
Sorry, what?
how influential was it in the post-war primary process?
Well, it's hard to say because there were sort of two things going on in New Hampshire as I was growing up. One was that people from more enlightened states were moving there to avoid property taxes and stuff, and so there was a kind of influx of let's say more liberal opinions and more liberal sensibilities, and at the same time this very very reactionary Republican kind of backbone to, especially in southern New Hampshire. I don't know why, but well, I know why, because southern New Hampshire was basically it was factories. It was textile factories. It was shoe factories. It was people what you'd call unskilled labor, or semi-skilled labor, and people that hadn't gone to college and people that hadn't gone to high school, and there was a lot of that in my family. There was a lot of that, a sort of abjection. I mean, there was uh, it was a poor area. It was um,
Was there any union presence to speak of in those
um,
shops?
no, actually. I think, well, there may have been in the places like Raytheon, and
Yeah.
some of those places may have had unions, but well, I mean, there were probably unions actually. I'm not sure about the shoe shops and the textile places, but the electronic places that sort of sprang up in the early 60s, I'm sure were unionized, maybe. Um,
Yeah.
but there wasn't a big union movement. In fact, I mean, unions were sort of demonized as corrupt,
Hmm.
But then sometimes, for instance, there were like, I remember at one point that Jimmy Hoffa became a big hero
Mhm.
for some reason, for the paper, at least, the Manchester Union leader. Yeah, I don't, it's hard to say. I mean, I was a kid. I can't even remember that far back now. Um, but
Well, I think in the election piece, you talk about he kind of had this triangular position as an enemy of Robert Kennedy.
well, yeah, the Kennedys were very much demonized. Um, uh, and well, I mean, J. Edgar Hoover was a big hero to
Yeah.
people. I'm just remembering there was a number you could call that was like the Minutemen, And they would tell you where all the missile silos were. And
Um,
different time.
JFK is the subject of one of the longer and also magnificent pieces in your book that I believe you wrote on the occasion of Oliver Stone's film.
Yeah. Uh,
I mean, of course, that event still looms large, but for it seemed to me growing up, and at least it it loomed as the largest thing in American memory
yeah,
between its occurrence and say at least say September 11th, perhaps.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember sitting around the television, my aunt's house, the day of the assassination. I mean, it wasn't like anybody took any pleasure in this event. I mean, it was really, truly horrifying. It was like the end of the world. How could somebody shoot the president?
Yeah.
Um, the
Do you
the
think our understanding of it has evolved in any way that's been useful or enlightening or realistic?
well, no, because there's never been any real explanation of what happened that could satisfy everybody's um, desire for an explanation, because they still don't know. I mean, who actually shot Kennedy? I mean, they don't know. It's supposedly Oswald. You can take it that Oswald did it, but you could also, there's so many different versions of what happened. Um, the mafia in Marseille, hired by Giancana and the rest of the mafia, and all there were so many theories of it. I think that the thing that was important about it, and that remains important about it, was like, see, I think of the Kennedy assassination and the Kitty Genovese story as being kind of
Mhm.
interlocked. Even though now it's been retrospectively demonstrated that the Kitty Genovese story really didn't unfold the way that it was reported.
Right.
At
Which
the
is to say, a
time,
lot of people saw what happened and didn't
and,
neglect to.
and didn't call the police or didn't intervene, but that is not actually what happened.
Right.
Um, but that's how it was reported, and that's how it entered American public consciousness, was that now people don't care about their neighbor, they don't care about the violence happening in front of them, they're just going to walk past it or just ignore it or close their window. And it seemed like a kind of, in tandem with the Kennedy assassination, a kind of loss of some sort of social cohesion that uh, sort of spelled the beginning of the end of America somehow. Um,
Well, I mean, now we live in a nation that has mass shootings that are nationally reported on a such a regular basis that we cease to notice many of them.
well, and nobody does anything to alleviate this situation. I mean, other countries, you can't get a weapon,
Yeah.
you know, and I don't think that people in those countries are necessarily complaining that their rights are being taken away from them, that they can't own an arsenal in their basement, but somehow this narrative of the Second Amendment being some sort of sacrosanct thing that gives people the right to have arms also, implicitly has to do with the right to shoot people, the right to kill people. I mean, look at that guy, what's his name, Zimmerman or whatever, that creep that shot Trayvon Martin. Um, it's like it's the next step. It's like and because that's so. But I don't know. I mean, that's um, it's yeah. There's a mass shooting every day in this country.
Yeah.
Uh,
Sometimes multiple of them. Do you think, and yet, well, now there are so many of them that they're, it seems the meaning of them tends to be lost, as opposed to something like the murder of the Black Dahlia, for example.
Well, yeah, because they don't really mean anything. All they mean is that people who are unhappy, and have a right to bear arms, they can just lose it one day and just shoot people, just shoot people at their school, shoot people at the movie theater, shoot people at the mall, whatever. It's not as focused, and it doesn't resonate the way something like the Black Dahlia or the Boston Strangler or some of these, sort of extraordinary, outrageous homicides do of individual people. You know, in some sense, if you kill 35 people at once, that doesn't really mean anything, except that they're dead. Um,
An exception, perhaps, within the pages of this book might be the Boston Marathon bombing and the Tsarnaev brothers. What attracted you to that subject? I mean,
well,
we
um,
worked on that piece. We happened to work on that piece together at the
yeah, we
LRB.
did actually. Yeah, I read Mosh's book, and I followed all of the coverage of it, and I think what attracted me to it was the same thing that attracted me to the Menendez brothers. This kind of Bengali relationship between the older brother and the younger brother, and um, the kind of folie à deux that happened between these two young men, and then also all of the backstory of those people, of the whole family, which I thought you can't understand this event without understanding who they were. I mean, you can't understand, and it's still sort of inexplicable because nobody seems to have observed any kind of, long-term radicalization of these two kids. Um, yeah, it's different than Klebold and what's his name, going because that, like, that seems more of a American. It's a mm, there. Well, I'll tell you, the Tsarnaev story to me had a lot to do with um, every reaction causes an opposite reaction. I mean, like they went through, the family were pushed, or moved successively over and over again, trying to find some sort of stable situation, and came here, which was clearly a mistake.
Hmm.
This country wasn't set up like some social democracy in Western Europe where you might be able to get benefits and, you know, actual some help to really start a new life. I mean, you end up in Cambridge,
Right.
uh, in this, uh, yeah, but basically the initial draw to me was the two brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm really attracted to stories like that. Um,
Another writer on violence, uh, who's the subject of one of the essays in the book, is Jean-Patrick Manchette.
yeah,
You describe both your first encounter with his work and what it's meant to you.
well, it's kind of weird, but um, I I when I was really young, like when I was a teenager, I went to see a program of short films, and one of them was by this guy, um, Robert Lepujade, called Les Secrets. And I learned years later, and it stuck in my mind. The film stuck in my mind. This was in the late 60s. I didn't find out until years later that Menchette had actually written this film that I saw. or he'd written the dialogues for it. I found, I don't know, I think the first things I saw were the uh, City Lights,
City Lights editions of
you know, Three to
Gunman.
Kill and
Kill.
Prone Gunman.
Yeah.
And then around the same time I was in Paris and I just bought all of them. They were all in print.
Mhm.
And, over a period of years, sort of got into them. It's hard for me to read
This
French.
is after he was already dead of cancer, or not quite.
Well, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
By the time I got into them, he was dead. Um, uh, yeah, I was sort of fascinated by this kind of weird merger of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and French leftist uh, radical uh, stuff all mushed together.
It's a different mix than you get in, say, the revivals of Chandler in the 1970s and like the Elliot Gould version of The Long Goodbye.
Yeah,
Something much more contemporary to Manchette's novels,
yeah.
yet
Uh,
still connected to that old noir tradition in America that had kind of veered in a different direction.
well, I mean, The Long Goodbye is pretty amazing as well.
It's one of my favorite films, certainly, but
Yeah.
it's like
It's a
it.
different sensibility. I mean, Elliot Gould's a very sympathetic character
Sure.
in that film, and in Manchette, there aren't any sympathetic characters really. I mean, they're not people that you know, take a great deal of interest in their interiority, even if they have any. Um, there's usually one person, or there's usually a figure or two figures in the case of Mad and
The Mad and the Bad.
the Bad. The woman and the little kid.
Right.
Um, uh, that you kind of cheer for them because they're the least repulsive people in the book, but they're pretty.
Even she commits a gratuitous murder on the highway,
Yeah, she does.
and that when that child enters the narrative, he's just a classic spoiled brat.
Well, yeah, because I think that and Chandler, for instance, yeah, he's a spoiled brat, the kid, and I mean, there's no, I mean, because of the kind of behaviorist position that Menchett took, he's basically saying, look, anybody pushed to this place will do this.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because this may not connect directly, but I remember something that Mary McCarthy wrote about, I think, Nazis or people in the concentration camps. Like somebody saying, "Well, I was forced to kill my friend," and she said, "No one can force you to kill your friend. They can tempt you to kill your friend." you know. Um, Whereas in Manchette, it's just like, this is what people are under it all.
Yeah.
Um,
Under extreme forms of duress and is essentially in a survivalist mode.
yeah, I mean, within an economic system that exploits everybody,
Yeah.
basically. Um,
Um, how can we talk about some of the filmmakers you write about
sure.
in the book? There's Pasolini, of course. There's oh, I don't have my table of contents out here in front of me, but it's
Uh,
overwhelmingly it's generally European filmmakers, and
yeah, I think it's all European filmmakers in the book. Well, maybe not, but oh no, because I have pieces
oh,
on uh
there's there's the piece on
Errol Morris.
Errol Morris, right?
And LA plays itself, that guy.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I guess that brings us to the question of negativity and why that's an important option for a critic, because those are pieces, and those are two of the, shall we say, harsher or more acidic pieces in the book.
Yeah. Well, in both cases, sort of very reactive to things that bothered me.
Hmm.
I don't believe in being negative for the sake of being negative, but it just seemed to me that, I mean, the Errol Morris film I thought was incredibly pretentious, and got nowhere with McNamara,
Yeah,
who,
Fog
of
of War.
course, and the other film I wasn't quite as harsh about. I mean, yeah, I thought some of it some of the points he was making in his voiceover were jejune, let's say. But then, I also pointed out that, he did show the underclass in Los Angeles. He did, I wasn't completely negative about it. Um, I think it depends. I mean, I made mistakes in the course of my career of, like, being dismissive of things that were well meant. Um, and I'll own that. I mean, I went after somebody once and I actually felt terrible later that, it was somebody whose first movie was,
Hmm.
based on some Max Ophel, on Le Ronde, and it just didn't work for me, and I thought it was really kind of clumsily acted and clumsily constructed, but it was well meant, and it wasn't like it wasn't a film that anybody was holding a gun to my head that I had to go see it. With more Errol Morris, however, that's the darling of the New York Times, the darling of PBS, the darling of all these people, and I think he's a terrible filmmaker. Um, maybe with some exceptions in his career, but I think, this is somebody that really thinks that he's doing something he's not doing. Um, and the others, I think, well, where do we want to go with negativity? I mean, it's
Yeah.
um,
Well, negativity.
sometimes there are certain things that sort of cry out for, having their balloon punctured.
Mhm.
And that's all there is to it. And you know that nobody else is going to do it. And that people are all going to say, "Oh, you're so mean," you know. But even the people that go on about how mean you are actually agree with you. It's
Yeah.
just that, nobody is going to stick their neck out to say what's clear to everybody, just about.
I mean, which comes first, the valence of positivity or negativity, or coming to an understanding of the subject under review?
Well, let's say the Errol Morris film. Okay, Robert McNamara. I mean, that's a figure from my youth. I mean, I was alive during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and I remember what Robert McNamara did. Um, I remember it very well, and he never had to pay a price for it, ever. Doctoring all these casualty figures and everything else to keep the war going, um, and that had real consequences. It had real life and death consequences. So for me, that gives me permission to
Right.
change the film.
How
Um,
about what about the question of politics when it comes to a filmmaker like Pasolini or a writer like Renate Adler or Manchette or Samuel Beckett, whose letters are reviewed within these pages?
uh,
You
well,
One
uh,
hears nowadays that all criticism has been politicized, but often superficially. How how much part of how important a part of the equation do you think it is?
normally not that important.
Yeah.
I don't equate art making with politics. I think it's a completely different. These are two really separate things. Unless you're going to put them together the way, like, you're going to take a former Secretary of Defense and put him on camera for 3 hours.
Right.
And then you are making you are making a political polemic in a way.
Hmm.
Um, Normally not. I mean, Pasolini certainly. Or even Renata. I mean, I don't maybe politically agree with a lot of, or maybe I have a different take on certain things politically from those people, but that's not what I get from those people. It's not what I care about. With Renata, I care about someone whose mind is so sharp and whose prose is so clean and smart.
Hmm.
And Pasolini, I mean, I don't know why Pasolini has entered my life in such a big way over the years. I really can't account for that. It's just like Warhol. I mean, I probably care a lot more about Pasolini than I do about Warhol. Warhol is not really an interesting figure for me, but somehow
Yet you were there. You were around at
it
the
was
time.
around. So, of course, when something sort of violates my sense of what was reality,
Yeah.
um, I will point it out. But these are, a lot of this is subjects that I wouldn't necessarily have. Uh, well, I guess I did choose them, but
Or at least accept them.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember the book I did on Pasolini was because the BFI were doing these books on individual films, and I thought, well, what film would they absolutely not do? And so I thought Salo, I'll do a book on Salo. Um, but I mean, in the course of putting that book together, I realized that my sense of politics is very different from Pasolini's, but it didn't matter. Because I thought it was a very powerful film and it made a very powerful statement about fascism. Um, and and then the others are just, I mean, like Barbet's films. Um, I can't remember, was it Melville that I had two pieces on, or Bresson, maybe.
Yeah.
Um, those are just artists that I never use the word admiration, as you know, but they are artists that I really admire. I think that Bresson is like really, really impressive artist. Well, Pasolini too, in a different way.
Yeah.
I think the totality of Pasolini's work has to be considered rather than individual films. I mean, there's all. I don't think he, except maybe Salo and some early films. I don't think he really um, created these absolutely seamless works of art. I think a lot of them were especially the Canterbury Tales and ones like that. Um, are I won't say sloppy, but there's certainly themes in them. Um, but to go back to the original question, I don't I don't judge works of art usually according to what politics they convey. I mean, I love Celine, for instance.
Sure.
Um,
The
and
well, not to interrupt, but if it's all right,
yeah,
a lot of these works were created within a post-war context, aesthetic, political context, where the memory of fascism was very recent, and the Holocaust and the war and Hitler and the looming apocalypse of the Cold War was, you know, present the entire time. But a lot of the writings in this book, uh, you know, were a lot of you. It's a lot of stuff that you wrote after 1991 or
oh well,
however, when the
actually,
context changed. But we still, I guess, what I'm trying to get at is we have. It seems to me often that we live in a time when those analogies are always ready at hand, but are deployed in a very flimsy manner. Analogies to the Second World War or the Cold War.
yeah.
Um, how useful do you think those historical moments are currently as frames of reference for understanding what's going on today?
Well, I don't think that whatever, worldview Joe Biden has running around in his head is necessarily the best one, to apply to the situation that we're in now. I, I mean, I think that fascism, it's not something that they put to bed in 1945.
Yeah.
And, but, um, clearly it's a different world, and the solutions to these things, well, I don't know. I mean, I think this is a really wiggy time because there's this incredible resurgence of authoritarianism and so on, and that looks very much in the ascendancy. And I don't think simply by, you can't fight it with the arguments that people used during the Cold War. It doesn't work. Although um, I think that what happened that was a big mistake was, having the Soviets at the Nuremberg trials. I mean, it was like we getting one totalitarianism passing judgment on the other totalitarianism instead of just acknowledging that, there's no civil liberties in the Soviet Union. There's no, and same is true in Russia now. Um, I don't, I don't think you can fight evil today with the arguments in 1945 or 1956 or any of that. I don't have an answer. That's why I have decided that like that I am really stepping away from any kind of political involvement because I don't know what to do, and I don't have any advice for anybody how to. I don't know. I want to retreat from all of that.
Um, what among I don't I sort of came to the conclusion recently in thinking about another writer and critic that it's and this is to perhaps circle back to the Mary McCarthy again, that it's the sometimes a critic's best role is in evaluating not necessarily their contemporaries but the generation that came before them,
Uh-huh.
immediately before them, that they witnessed in their youth and perhaps in their uh, descent towards something either disappointing or more glorious or just an end point. I mean, I don't know. Are there still any looming figures from your youth that you haven't written on that you have always meant to?
Hmm. Um,
Something I've never asked you personally, but I don't know. It just popped into my head.
yeah, well, there's a lot of things that I probably should have written about that I didn't. I only ever wrote one piece on Werner Schroeder for art form, and it wasn't a very good piece. And that was somebody who had more effect on me than almost anybody in my life in terms of another artist or somebody. I mean, he was pretty much contemporary with me, but he started making films long before I ever thought of doing anything. Um, and in terms of writers, I don't know. I wish that I had written a really good essay on Natalia Ginsburg. I wish I had written a really good essay on Anna Kavan. Maybe I still will. Um, there's various people that I sometimes, like, I pick up a book by one of those people and I think, well, why didn't I ever write about this person? Because I'm always returning to this person. It's, today, Graham Greene. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
who I love, and it was certainly just as important to me as almost any other writer, but I've never written about him. Um, so yeah, there are certainly figures from an earlier time that I never got around to, or the opportunity never presented itself. But also, as you know, at a certain point, when you're doing this stuff to make a living,
Yeah.
which I was for years, you don't have that much of a choice about, I mean, you have maybe a choice about what you're going to write about, but it's different than when you were not writing to make a living.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and uh, and I guess, I would like to find my way back to that early moment where you just write what you want to write. I mean, I could do it now,
Yeah.
I mean, I have the freedom to do it now, but I don't have the energy and I don't have the brains anymore. I mean,
Well, I think that the example of the very recent Warhol piece speaks against that.
well, I
To be
hope,
honest, Gary.
yeah, and that was something like that, it was impossible for me to not do that.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure why, because I don't care about Andy Warhol really, but it's just, except to the same extent that, I mean, he got into the water supply, but
Hmm.
that book was so wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, methodologically wrong in its sensibility, wrong in its conclusions, wrong in its suppositions, just wrong. Um, you know, so yeah, I could still do it, um, but I don't know. I mean, you get old.
Sure.
Sorry to say, I'm
Yeah. No,
old.
I'm learning about it every day. Um,
Well, strangely enough, I mean, the novel I'm working on now it's turning out to be a novel about getting old.
mhm.
Um, it's like most of the characters are really old.
Yeah, I mean, and another, well, I guess I think of Do Everything in the Dark as another book of yours that's in part about, uh, well, I guess the moment shortly after youth, one might say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when things
For
didn't turn out the way people expected,
Yeah,
basically.
and
Um,
it's also a book that's very much connected to the, I guess, what one might call the aftermath of the downtown or East Village scene of the 1980s and 70s, 80s, and 90s.
yeah,
I know this is a sore subject for you sometimes, but it's one that people always ask you about. But
yeah.
how do you feel about your association in readers' minds with that phase of local history?
Well, um, I don't know. I feel that, you should read more of my work. I mean, it's not that localized.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah. And,
I have a very jaundiced view of being typed as a downtown writer or downtown East Village is this, East Village that. Okay, the only reason I still live in the East Village is because I have a rent stabilized apartment here. I don't live here most of the time. Um, I just keep it because my doctors are in New York and et cetera, et cetera. And I still have some residual fondness for New York in a way. I mean, I keep looking for what isn't there anymore, but
the other day, I was reading one of Cookie Mueller's essays or details columns that kind of played around with the question of whether there would be history classes about the East Village art scene of the 1980s, which I think probably actually now exist.
I'm sure.
But it's very funny in that context. And I'm sure that, well, those classes better be using you as a text now into how long they last.
Well, Cookie had the best take on all that stuff, I mean, it was just funny.
Yeah. All right, Gary. So I see we've been told to call it quits.
Yeah.
I'll be I've got to go to play rehearsal now, but
Oh, congratulations on your great thespian success.
thank you. Thank you.
Um,
This one's for a new one that we haven't read yet, but
uh-huh.
I'll come and find you for a drink before you go to LA.
Yeah, I'm going to be here at least this week and next week.
All right.
We
Well,
can leave after that.
see you next week.
See you next
Week,
day.
and
Okay.
over to you, Evan.
Evan.
Thank you so much to Gary, Indiana, and Christian Lorentzen for that wonderful conversation. I can't recommend Fire Season enough. If you want to read some essays about people, the plaudits come to the people who really deserve it, and the people who deserve to get their balloon deflated really do get it. So I really can't recommend grabbing this collection enough. We've got copies at the store at 192, so come by whenever you can. We're open every day from 11 to 7. If you can't make it to Chelsea, we've got a link right on this page below where you can order it from bookshop.org. That really helps us out as well. This event has been recorded. It'll be posted immediately after. So if you missed it, or if you missed the beginning or want to share it with a friend, spread that around. If you go to our website, you can also find recordings of all our past events. You can also find out about our future events. I think we have a good one on Cherie Cherie coming up, the new Colette translation that's coming out. So keep your eyes peeled, sign up for our email newsletter, and thank you again to Gary and Christian. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Evan.
And I guess we click leave now. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.